one of my favorite famous Ozarkers. We'll do another famous Ozarker in honor of it. Well, baseball season has been started now for the better part of a month, but we'll do a baseball special. We had our March Madness special, and this is our baseball special. Today's famous Ozarker. Yeah, there have been dozens of Ozarkers who've played Major League Baseball, but this is probably not the best one, but he was a good player and one of the most memorable. Not Dizzy Dean. That's he is a pitcher. You got that part right. Dizzy was a pitcher, and this guy was a pitcher. Looks like he's reading an NFL magazine or something like that. All right, nobody knows who this is? All right, you probably heard the name. Anybody ever heard of Preacher Row? Preacher Row. And if you've been to West Plains, you've been on Preacher Row Boulevard. He was born in Ash Flat. Remember the other famous Ozarker we had who was from Ash Flat?
Was it Paul Marcus? No.
It was another one of the athletes. It was the basketball guy, Gordon Carpenter. Remember the Olympic basketball player? He was from Ash Flat. Preacher Row was born in Ash Flat. He actually grew up in another little town called Viola, Arkansas, and was signed by the St. Louis Cardinals out of college. He was a college baseball and basketball player and signed as a pitcher with the Cardinals. Played with them briefly, then kind of disappeared from the major leagues for several years and then resurfaced and ended up having his greatest seasons with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was a teammate of Jackie Robinson in Brooklyn and was, as you can see there, he was the 1951 National League Pitcher of the Year. He was a very good pitcher, a left-hander, soft tosser, wily left-hander.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I was just going to ask, do you know what his thoughts were on playing with Jackie Robinson?
I don't really know. Preacher Row, I talked to him once, and this was probably 20 years ago, and I called him and I wanted to do an interview with him, like an oral history interview. And at that time, as far as I know, he didn't do interviews. I know that he told me that he didn't do interviews, and I never saw any interviews with him, in the last, 40 or 50 years of his life. And I don't know if it was because he didn't want to talk about Jackie Robinson or it was just because he was a private guy and didn't want people bothering him. Being a former Brooklyn Dodger, I'm sure that there were probably lots of people, lots of New Yorkers who wanted to talk to him and were always wanting to interview him for this or that. But I really don't know, where he stood with that. Yeah. But he was this is back in the days when baseball players didn't make enough in 1 year to buy, a desert island somewhere and retire and never work again. And he actually, in the off season, he would come back to Arkansas, and he had a job as a high school basketball coach. And so when he wasn't playing baseball in the summer, he was a basketball coach in high school, and he actually injured himself in a basketball game. He got punched in the face by a referee. He got in an argument with a referee and got punched in the face. And actually, I think it knocked him down, and he somehow injured himself in this high school basketball game. And one of the in this little high school, he was the high school coach at Hardy. I pointed out Hardy, Arkansas earlier on the railroad there. It's a little tourist town now, and one of the referees that he would often hire to come and referee his high school basketball games was another baseball player named George Kell. And George Kell is in the Hall of Fame. Yeah, he was a Detroit Tiger, third baseman for the Tiger, and then a longtime announcer, radio, color analyst for the Detroit Tigers. And but Kell, can you imagine that? This is what a different age it was. You had a major league pitcher and a major league third baseman, in this little high school gym in this little town in Arkansas, actually working in the off season because they had to make ends meet. It's just a different sort of world than you get now.
He got the pitcher of the year. He was 35 years old.
Yeah, he was.
They're all worked out by the time they're 30.
Right, he was a late bloomer. He really, most of his success he had relatively late in his career, in his mid-30s when he was his best. But after he retired, he lived in West Plains for pretty much the rest of his life and managed a grocery store. I think he owned a grocery store in West Plains and ran the store for years and years. And that's why they've got Preacher Row Boulevard in West Plains. He ended up living most of his life there in West Plains. Yeah. And he died the very first semester that I taught here at Missouri State. I remember driving to work one morning and they announced that Preacher Row had died. And as you can see there, he was in his 90s when he died. Okay, so our word of the day, we've met Preacher Row. Our word of the day is rising. That's how you say this, rising. You might know what a rising. It's a noun. I got another stumper, huh? Nobody knows what a rising is. All right, nobody's going to get rising. It is a boil.
A boil?
Yeah.
Oh, is that where the guy bled to death?
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. It was. The guy, one of the characters in It Goes to the Ozarks, his brother tried to lance a rising off of his neck and I guess cut his jugular or something, and he bled to death. And so that inspired the sample sentence up there. Except Sam didn't quite bleed to death; he just almost bled to death. But the character in the book actually met his demise during World War II, not on the field of battle, but from trying to cut a rising off of his neck. So that's a warning to you all. Don't let your brother operate on you. Yeah, go to the doctor, especially when your brother is not certified. But that's what a rising is. All right, we'll finish our discussion of mining and this one element of modernization. We'll get into some 20th century modernization just a little bit before we get to Ghost of the Ozarks. We've talked about mining in the eastern Ozarks, the old Lead Belt area, and in the tri-state area of southwest Missouri. The first mining boomtown was not Joplin, it was actually Grandin. And Grandin's still there. It's a little bitty town down in southwest Missouri, just probably fewer than 1,000 people today. But at one time it was a mining boomtown, but it petered out by the time of the Civil War and never really caught back on after the war. After the war, it was Joplin where the great discovery was made of minerals and especially lead ore. And it quickly became a boom town in the early 1870s. And it wasn't lead ore as much as zinc that became the great mineral product of the tri-state district of the Joplin area. Zinc is something that's usually mined and produced in association with lead ore. And so that became very important for southwest Missouri and southeastern Kansas and northeastern Oklahoma. Joplin, of course, attracted railroad service, as we mentioned. And you can see, you want to talk about a boom town. In 1870, at the 1870 census, there was no Joplin. There was just, a few scattered farms where Joplin is today. And by the next census in 1880, there were over 7,000 people living there. And you can imagine that Joplin was a wild mining boom town. You know, just all the images that conjures up of a boom town. Lots of taverns, probably lots of brothels. You know, that kind of you know, an overpopulation of young single males. Lots of fighting. You know, regular killings, all that kind of stuff. And you can see by 1900 it had grown to be the fourth largest city in Missouri. And by the end of the century, by the end of the 1800s, Southwest Missouri was already leading the world in zinc production and would continue to do so for several years into the 20th century. And there's a postcard of a mining operation in Joplin. Here's another picture of the mining industry at Joplin, and again, one of our maps. This is a little more of a concentrated map. Again, it's showing this district up here, and there was some mining that went on up there, but again, we're talking about our three main districts, three main mining districts. And we're not going to talk specifically about the North Arkansas district. We will talk a little bit about the timber industry. And we know that played a role in bringing the railroad to the region. And a lot of the branch lines in different places were motivated by large stands of virgin timber. And what is tie hacking? You remember from the film? Yeah, remember that the Shannon County film talked a little bit about tie hacking. I think even showed maybe a little bit of that. And that's the process of making railroad ties, which up until well into the 20th century, they were made by hand. Yeah, with a broad axe. So these were very common activities. You can see that the railroads themselves consumed lots and lots of wood. Just the process of cutting all those ties for the building of railroad tracks consumed lots and lots of wood. When in southeast Missouri, where these great pine forests were, when the railroads came in and the timber companies first came in, it was people bragged that there was a 300-year supply of timber and stuff like that, but it didn't hardly last 300 years. It lasted, in most cases, less than 50 years before all the really accessible, good forests had been cut out in southeast Missouri. The way this developed was southeast Missouri and the pine forests, the hardwood forest of parts of Missouri, northwest Arkansas, they were just the latest in a line of forests that these companies had traveled. Sometimes some of these companies trace their roots all the way back to New England, having gone from New England to like upstate New York, to the Great Lakes, Michigan, Wisconsin, cutting the forests up there, and then coming down the Mississippi River to Missouri, on down to Louisiana, to the deep south pine forest after that. A lot of these were the same companies. They just migrated from one virgin forest area to the next, and cut out the really big companies got the easiest, most accessible trees and then moved on. I mean, they were after efficiency, spend as little money as you can, get the most profits you can, and then move on. And then there would be other smaller companies, or sometimes the local mom and pop operations, that after the big companies left would come in and harvest the timber that was left. And that's what you've still got, for the most part today in the Ozarks, that's what you've still got, are these smaller timber companies. You got some big timber companies operating the Ozarks, but in most places it's the smaller mills that are just kind of poking around because, the virgin forests are gone. And they aren't coming back in our lifetime. They aren't coming back until people just completely quit cutting trees for, a couple hundred years and let them come back. But so those days are over, and that 300-year supply turned out not to be a 300-year supply. We know that we saw a little footage on the Shannon County film of cutting and floating these ties, hacking ties, and floating them down rivers. That was very common. Usually floating them down to the nearest railroad spot where they could be loaded onto railroad cars and shipped off to wherever they were needed. So the railroad's always involved in this somehow. And then speaking of that pine timber industry in southeast Missouri, Grandin is the best example of a timber boom town over in southeast Missouri. It was the site of a huge mill that cut pine timber on a branch, on a railroad branch, and it was founded by some businessmen, some lumbermen from Pennsylvania, who sent one of their guys into southeast Missouri to run the operation, and most of the profits were funneled out of the region, as generally happened with the timber industry and a lot of the mining industry as well. And you can see there at the peak of this operation in Grandin, Missouri, you had over 1,200 workers just in the mills alone, and that's not counting all the lumberjacks out there and the farmers who cut timber and sold it to the company. So you had a massive operation, a massive mill that closed down in the early 1900s in Grandin. And today, if you go to Grandin, there's just not much of anything. The last time I was in Grandin, there was a little store, like a bank branch, and that was about it in Grandin. But at one time, it was the largest town in that whole area. It was the first town in that whole area of southeast Missouri to get electricity. It had a brand new, it had a big high school, like a top-rated high school, big library, had a hospital. It was just, but it was all funded by this lumber company money, and once the lumber company up and moved its operation somewhere else, Grandin just pretty much folded, and it's been in a century of decline since then. We'll talk just a little bit about the 20th century, and of course, in the 20th century, you get the replacement of the railroad by automobiles and highways. And as we've already seen when we looked at our railroad maps, in a lot of cases, the highways simply followed the railroads or built next to the railroads. That happened a lot. But Missouri established its first state highway department in 1921. Before this, all of the road building in Missouri, and most states for that matter, was done on a county-by-county basis, locally maintained roads. In the 19th century and into the early 20th century, the way that county roads were maintained was that every able-bodied adult male was expected to devote a certain number of days each year to road work. And each township or each road district would have a supervisor. It'd just be, some prominent person in the community, and it was that supervisor's responsibility to get the work, to send out these little notes to all the men saying, report here on such and such a date and bring a rake or shovel or something like that. And they would, literally people would just get together and work on the roads for like a week. Or you could, if you had money, you could basically pay your way out of it. but that was very rare. In most places in the Ozarks, usually you were stuck with road duty for a while. But in the 1920s, you get the State Highway Department created. You get finally the first kind of statewide planning of the building of roads, thinking of building roads from one county to the next and having them all connect and sort of thinking of it in terms of a statewide grid of highways. In 1926, the federal government first designates U.S. highways, and a lot of those in those days were routes or routes, however you pronounce that word. We'll stick with Route 66, which became the most famous probably of all of these U.S. highways founded in the 1920s. Route 66 was set up to stretch from Chicago to Los Angeles, and of course it came through the Ozarks, came down the spine of the Ozarks. And here's Chicago up here, and this particular bulletin or travel mat or whatever you call it ends in Springfield, but obviously the Route 66 goes on to the west coast. And but you can see that it's basically I-44 in the Ozarks is basically where I-44 is today, and it comes through Springfield and becomes a very, very important for commerce in the Ozarks, at least part of the Ozarks of Missouri. And then finally, in the 1950s, you get the creation of the Eisenhower interstate system. That's the federal bill that actually creates what we know as interstate highways today and launches the most massive road building project maybe in human history. I'm not really sure what kind of scale that is, but certainly a massive road building project that was scheduled to be completed in the early 1970s, and a lot of it was finished by the 1970s. But of course, the interstate building process continues today. There are still highways that are sucked into the interstate highway system yet today, and we know that in the Ozarks, we've really just got the one interstate highway. We've got I-44.
System was somewhat that's a public works project in human history.
Is it the most massive public works project in human history? Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah, it's. I mean, it was just a tremendous boon to the American economy in so many ways, and part of the reason it's both a reflection and a reason for the great post-World War II prosperity of America in many ways. Yeah. So, and it comes to the Ozarks at least in a small way in terms of Interstate 44, which takes the place of Route 66, at least in Missouri. Here's a 1926 Missouri State Road map. And now, I can't read the legend, but a lot of these, according to the legend up here, a lot of these roads are actually going to be planned highways. It's hard to tell. It's the roads, the map is too fuzzy to really make out which ones are planned. But here's Route 66 here that comes down from St. Louis to Springfield and on. And then a lot of these roads down in here are really more planned roads in the 1920s. There were roads there, but they weren't. All of those roads down in the heart of the Ozarks would have been gravel at best, and probably a lot of them were just dirt still in the 1920s. This one's from the 1950s. And again, you get a little bit of the sense like we had with the railroad map, where kind of the one area of Missouri that's not as well developed in terms of roads highways is kind of this great southern part down in the Ozarks south of what becomes I-44. Here's Springfield. So you still got the big road coming down the spine of the Ozarks, but you don't see any more really dark roads in here, so no big roads. A lot of little state lines in there. And then I think there's one more on here. And that's a 1970 map after I-44. And again, you can sort of see that the red roads are the U.S. highways. They're not state highways, they're the U.S. highways. And again, much of the Ozarks is free of U.S. highways. So there's still a remote quality to the Ozarks by 1970 that continues today. There's still large stretches of the Ozarks today where you don't have U.S. highways. You have smaller two-lane state roads and things like that. Some of the state roads are really nice. Highway 5, that's a really good state road. Again, it's a slow process of modernization, and in some ways, just like the railroad map, we can look at a more modern state highway map and still see that in a lot of ways the Ozarks tends to be the most rural, the least developed part of Missouri in terms of what's really the modern element of the 20th century, and that's highways and automobiles. Well, that's the charm of Ozarks Backroads. You really don't know if you're trespassing or not as you travel through the region.
Some farm, and like a farmer came out, and I was like, turn around.
Yeah.
I don't know, I didn't look.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is, people who live in the rural Ozarks are used to that, used to people kind of stumbling onto their houses thinking they're on a county road. It turns out not to be. And I've seen, I can think of a road down in Arkansas that's a county road, but it's the weirdest thing. You go right by this, you go right through this person's farm and right by their house, and they've got a fence built on both sides right up to the road where it looks like you're going through a gate. They don't actually have a gate there, but they've got a cattle guard. And I don't know if you know what a cattle guard is. It's like a metal grate built into the road, and you drive across it. It's a county road. You drive across this cattle guard, and the first time I went through there, I was just out back roading, and I thought, I'm going into this guy's field. This is I had a map. I had a real detailed like topo map with even the most remote county roads on it, and I thought, this cannot be right because it looks like I'm driving into his field across this cattle guard, but it was a county road. And, I kept driving and finally I came to another house, and it was just so sometimes you see these weird things. And if you use like, GPS maps, or you use some of these detailed like DeLorme map books you get or something like that, you can end up on dead-end roads that look like they're supposed to go somewhere, and they don't go anywhere just because people have moved away and they've just shut a county road down. They'll just gate it off or something, and you'll end up at a dead end somewhere 5 miles back in the woods, even though the map shows that you can keep going and come out somewhere else. It's the map's out of date, and I've done that a lot. But I've done a lot of back road. And a few times I've been like Ashley and thought, this is probably not a great idea, but most of the time I'm just stupid enough to keep going. Now, part of that is the process of naming roads, even little bitty gravel roads or dirt roads that probably don't go anywhere, comes about from the 911, implementing the 911 system in rural areas. You have, like in my home county, the county judge's office always had these detailed county road maps with county road numbers on them, but there were never any county road number signs. Up until 5 years ago, there were no signs almost anywhere. I mean, I don't know how any strangers or how the UPS guy got anywhere in my home county because there were no signs at all. There were just gravel roads, and the locals know where they're going, but nobody else does, and we don't care, if you don't know where you're going.
Turn around to Red Barn.
Right, yeah, that sort of thing. And then a few years ago, they went to the 911 system where you had to have named roads so that first responders could find you, if your meth lab blew up or something like that. But I just that's we're a couple weeks away from that discussion. But a dog bite or whatever, you get your leg baled up in a bale of hay. But yeah, a lot of the roads are really, really bad. And you think about it, these are counties that don't have much money. Some of the counties have a lot of the land is owned by the federal government because in counties where you have like the Mark Twain National Forest or the Ozark National Forest down in Arkansas, you got lots of land that doesn't really generate tax money locally, and so they don't have much money, and they may only be able to afford to grade a road, 2 or 3 times a year, and that's not going to keep a road in very good order. And they certainly can't afford to put gravel on them. They had gravel on them probably at one time, and it all washed away because they're all on the side of a hill or something. And so you get some really bad roads.
So it was 911, so many of these people got long driveways, the Rosebud Lane,
Yeah.
It was 911 that told them to do that, huh?
Yeah, my understanding is some counties had already done that, but in the particular county, in Ozark County where I'm from, that's what motivated the county to put up the road signs, which they just did a couple of years ago. We had no county road signs until just a couple of years ago.
I see them all over Greene County.
Yeah, well, Greene County's the most prosperous county of the Missouri Ozarks, and so they're more progressive, and they're certainly ahead of the curve. You get out into, like we were talking about, Douglas County or Wright County or Ozark County or somewhere like that, and out into the real Ozarks, you might call it, and then things get different. That's where you don't always have the money to for upkeep and certainly for signs and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments before we turn our attention to Ghost of the Ozarks and the idea of the exceptionalism of the Ozarks? All right, let's tell you what we'll do. Now, when I get this up on Blackboard, probably I'm going to put this up there without the 3 Missouri maps on it. Those are huge files, and it's already a big PowerPoint presentation with the pictures and stuff on it, but if I leave those 3 maps on there, if you've got relatively slow internet service, it may take you a week to get this thing pulled up. So probably what I'm going to do is just take those off before I put it on Blackboard because they're really big.